Hello, and welcome to episode 150 of the Book Binge. This is probably going to be a short video because today I just want to sort of rant a little bit. Like, not actually like an angry rant and actually yell at people and be angry at them, but I do want to get like a little bit of something that like bothers me a lot just off my chest and like maybe bring a little bit of awareness to the fact that like way too many people call things underrated when that's not actually what they mean. Now, some people, upon hearing that the first time, might be a little bit confused by what exactly I mean or what I might be trying to say in this video, so let's talk about it, because this is going to be mostly about what it means to be underrated versus simply underread, because a lot of people use the term underrated when they mean underread or underknown or some similar phraseology that isn't underrated, right? So let's actually talk about this. Underread or underwatched, underplayed, unknown, just some sort of descriptor for media that is not read or experienced by as many people as a person believes that should be the case. When you are talking about a book or a movie or whatever, like I said, that isn't as popular as you think you should be, that isn't as broadly known, as broadly read, or isn't talked about, perhaps, as much as you wish it was, you can use the term underread or whatever the similar is for any other type of medium. Generally, cult classics, things that are sleeper hits, might be considered something along these lines. What we call the deep cuts on an album, for example, could be used as a term of underlistened, underplayed, or underknown. Terms like this, as I said, that could be used to describe something that you think isn't experienced as often or as much or as regularly by people as you think it should be. Media that you love but you feel like nobody's heard of or that you have nobody to talk to, this is the term you should be using in this case. Underrated, the term that most everybody uses all of the time, isn't what underread means. A lot of people will say, oh yeah, that book, that movie, whatever is underrated, when actually it's not, because when something isn't as highly praised as you think it should be is when this term is appropriate, or when the general consensus, the general worldly opinion of a certain piece of media is a little bit lower than you think something should be. If a movie is often rated like very middle of the road, just kind of it exists kind of thing, but it's your favorite movie of all time, you can use underrated in that sort of instance. But if everybody in the world has watched that movie, underread doesn't apply, or vice versa. If nobody has watched a movie or read a book, but every single person who has watched or read that piece of media does love it, underrated does not apply in this case. A story can be underknown and underrated, this is true, but they are not the same thing. If your favorite book only has 10 ratings, but all 10 of those ratings are 5 stars, it is not underrated, but it is underknown, it is underread, it is underexperienced, as one might say. Know the difference between these two and when to use them appropriately. As I've said, most people who use underrated use it for both of these circumstances. And obviously, in one of these circumstances, it is correct. It is largely accurate. In the other case, and I think the case when most people tend to use underrated and don't realize it, they're using it wrong. Comparatively, what about overrated or perhaps overread? These aren't used quite as often, and when they are used, are actually tend to be used a little bit more appropriately, overrated especially. Most people seem to just consciously understand, or subconsciously understand, I suppose, just through the general workings of the entertainment medium, that saying something is overrated means people like it a lot more than you think they should, or people like it a lot more than you can understand. Regardless of the amount of ratings a book has, if every single one of those ratings is 5 stars, but you read it and you think it's 1 star, you might call that book overrated, and you are absolutely, you are entitled to that opinion. And you wouldn't be wrong for saying that, because if you didn't like it, but everybody else does, yeah, overrated applies. Underrated is definitely used in a very different way, as I've said multiple times up to this point, because I'm trying to drill this home. A lot of people use it to simply say that something is not experienced as much. not enough people have read this book. That book is so underrated. That is wrong. That is incorrect. You do not use the word that way because it's just wrong. That's not how you use it. You can say, not enough people have read this. And that could absolutely be true. Maybe not enough people have read that thing. But if every single person who has really loves it, it's not underrated. Like I said, a book can be underread and underrated, but it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. Correlation does not equal causation in this case. Here are some examples from my personal Goodreads library and books that I've read. A couple of books that I think are pretty much on target as, ratings go are 127 Hours, which has a 3.84 average star rating on Goodreads, and The Card Turner, which also has 3.84 stars. And, using Goodreads is kind of a hard gauge for something like this because often ratings tend to be overinflated. A lot of times average star ratings are a little bit higher than you might see in smaller subsets of groups just because of the sheer amount of ratings that there are. But that's kind of the point, right? 127 Hours has a little over 22,000 ratings, and considering the movie, that actually seems like a decent a sizable amount of people who have read and rated that book on Goodreads. Considering what it is, The Card Turner only has about 10,000 ratings, and considering what it is, yeah, that makes sense. It is by the author of Holes, and Holes is really famous, so maybe several thousand people read Holes and wanted to explore more of the author's catalog and found The Card Turner and read it and rated it as such. That was kind of how I discovered the book, for example. So regardless of the rating sizes of these two books, I think the 3.84 stars average on Goodreads for both of them is pretty appropriate. I don't think either of them are fantastic, phenomenal books that everybody should read that are masterpieces, because they're not. There are a couple of my personal favorite books, but those ratings seem pretty appropriate as far as averages go. For a couple books that I believe, personally are overrated, let's take Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which has a 4.24 star average rating on account of 626,000 ratings. A lot of people have read this, so 4.24 stars is really high, meaning the average is, the vast majority of people rate this 4 or 5 stars especially. Not very many people rated below that, relatively speaking, and I think this is overrated by a significant degree. It's a very well-known book. I think a lot of people would recognize it just by the name, sort of the name and the author, I suppose, because Rebecca is, of course, a name that everybody recognizes to some degree. But when I read this, I didn't particularly love it. I really liked the second half of it. In fact, I don't know if I actually have a dedicated review of the book. Maybe I should do one of those. I really liked the second half of the book, but the first half of it really, really dragged. And in fact, it might have even been more than half. It was a tough book for me to read and to actually get through. So the fact that the rating is as high as it is kind of surprises me, and I do think it is a little bit overrated. Same thing with The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which has a 3.99 average rating on account of 900,000 ratings. This, I think, is overrated because I did not like this book, and even though, I wish I did, I genuinely wish I did love the book, I didn't, and in fact, I really disliked the book when I read it that first time. And I think that the fact that the book is praised so heavily by, most people who you might meet who have read the book, it kind of just confuses me personally. So, I would consider The Road overrated. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is. I didn't like it very much, so, that's where my personal gauge comes into play as far as that book is concerned. Let's talk about some books that are underrated and genuinely using the correct term for this. In my opinion, at least, is kind of based off of some things. Artemis by Andy Weir has a 3.69 star average rating on account of 270,000 ratings on Goodreads, and to be honest, when I actually looked up this book on the site, I was kind of surprised that the rating was that high, but 3.69 is still relatively low as far as Goodreads averages are concerned, especially with a sample size this large, so you can say that people have a slightly more middling opinion of Artemis, especially when compared to The Martian or Project Hail Mary. I personally, when I read it the first time, this was years ago when it actually released, so I was a teenager. I wasn't as critical of a person. I'm generally easy to easy to please as is. So like I enjoyed Artemis, and I think that the general disdain that the book gets from a lot of people, there are so many people who either A, refuse to read it because they've heard bad things about it, or B, just think it's like the worst book ever written for whatever reason. And like, no, actually, I don't think it's that bad. And it's not that bad, but a lot of people really dislike it. So I think that Artemis is underrated, especially as far as Andy Weir is concerned, but it's definitely not underread. There's plenty of people who have read it. Comparatively, The Odyssey by Homer has a 3.81 star average rating on account of over 1 million ratings, nearly 1.1 million. So, again, another story that is definitely not underread, but I was surprised to find has a lower rating than even the Iliad does. That one really shocked me. So, in some sense, I can say I think the Odyssey is a little underrated. It's not like really underrated because clearly a lot of people still like it, but on account of it being poetry and like the substance and it being really old, there's definitely a good reason why this one might have a lower rating than like your average book published in the 21st century might have. But I do think that 3.81 stars for Goodreads average on account of 1 million reviews is a little bit lower than I would expect from the Odyssey, especially like I said, since it was lower than even the Iliad's average score. I forget what the Iliad's average score is, but it's higher than 3.81 stars. It actually seems a little bit more appropriate. So like, there's some stuff there that makes me think that, hey, the Odyssey is a little bit underrated, but maybe that's because a lot more people are forced to read the Odyssey in, say, high school, for example, and so maybe that's where some of that rating comes from, because often low ratings come from situations like that, as far as like classics and commonly read classroom books are concerned. But moving into the underread section, what are some books or series that I think are underread, but aren't necessarily underrated? The Adan trilogy by Philip Chase. The first book has 3.97 stars, the second book has 4.32 stars, third book has 4.45 stars. So clearly, this trilogy is not underrated. The first book having nearly 4-star average rating on account of 604 ratings is actually pretty good for an independently published fantasy book, and especially one written by somebody who has a YouTube channel, because often like there are certain subsets of people who just really dislike the fact that certain people who have YouTube channels write books for whatever reason, even if they review books on YouTube, which, that's a whole nother separate kind of discussion video. But the point is, like, I don't think these books are underrated. The first book having about 4 stars, yeah, makes sense. The second book having higher score, and the third book especially having the highest score of the 3, definitely makes sense. I don't think any of these scores are inappropriate, but I do think that not enough people have read them. 604 ratings for the first book, 182 for the second book, and 137 for the third book. I definitely think more people should continue because that third book, Return to Adan, is fantastic. Another series that I really love, it's on the shelf right behind me, Sun Eater, I think is underrated. The minimum score that one of the main 6 books in the series has is, at the time that I checked, 4.04 stars. So clearly the series is not underrated. The vast majority of people who have read Sun Eater really like it or love it, especially when you get further into the series. The average score generally gets higher and higher. And if you ask anybody's favorite book in the series, Demon in White, Howling Dark have very high number of people who say that. A lot of people say Disquiet Gods, the new one, is their favorite book in the series now. At the very least, it's top 3. So like, clearly this series is not underrated. Almost everybody who reads it loves it. You will be decently hard pressed to find reviews on this platform that disparage or straight up hate on Sun Eater. There are a couple that don't really like it, but like the vast majority of reviewers you find on YouTube or even other platforms, as I think I've seen as of recent, covering Sun Eater, really like it, really recommend it, and have gotten a lot of people into the series. The maximum amount of ratings that any one of the books has is like 12,000 ratings for Empire of Silence, and like that's not actually that many ratings for a science fiction series, for example. I mean, like, it is plenty, it is popular enough, it's been gaining traction the last year or two, but like it was only like a year or so ago, maybe even less, when Empire of Silence did not even have 10,000 ratings. So like, it's jumping up, yes, But again, I think it is a decent bit underread compared to what I think it should be. It's my favorite series. Rockio is my favorite author. I think everybody should read Sun Eater. So, like, barely 12,000 ratings on the first book is not enough, in my opinion. I can call Sun Eater underread, or I can call the Adan trilogy underread, but I can't reasonably really call either of them underrated, because they're not underrated. The people who have read them like them a lot in most cases, so calling them underrated is just wrong, whereas underread makes sense and is appropriate. But to continue my point, and I'm surprised this video has gone on this long, but to continue my point and really, the very last thing I'm going to talk about, let's mention two books that I think are both underread and underrated. You have Phoenix Island by, oh man, what's his name? John Dixon. The Phoenix Island duology is one of my absolute favorites. It is a YA duology, but it's one that, like, I don't know, I just got a lot out of it when I read it. Phoenix Island is one of my all-time favorite books for no other reason than because of how fondly I think about it and how it made me think about certain aspects of life and like a moral code, essentially, and how to wield power properly. For example, Phoenix Island is a book that again has a 3.84 star average rating, which isn't that low, but is relatively low for Goodreads standards, and only has like 2,000 ratings or less. And I think this book is definitely underrated. 2,000 ratings is not very much, and 3.84 stars, like I said, it's not horribly low, but it is a little low. I think it's definitely more worthy of a 3.9 plus star average rating at least. Given by such a low sample size, I'm surprised for the rating to be as low as it is anyway. So this is one I would consider both underrated and underread. And then another one that's a little bit of a weird example, I know, but Rage by Stephen King under the pseudonym Richard Bachman. Of course, this one's kind of hard to read because if you want to read it, you have to get it secondhand somehow. So like, it's actually hard to read unless you really make a point to do so, because it was taken off the legitimate market by King and his publishers plenty long time ago, actually. This book has 3.73 stars and only 48,000 ratings, and 48,000 ratings is quite a bit. It's a lot more than any of the other like underread examples I've given thus far, but like for a Stephen King book, 48,000 ratings is not very much at all. And 3.73 stars is a little bit underrated by Goodreads standards, and I think the book actually isn't that bad. You'll generally find a lot of people who read it, out of pure curiosity will say it's one of Stephen King's worst books. And like, when you have a catalog as big as Stephen King, fair enough. I'm not going to disparage that opinion, but a lot of people will say it's the bottom, and there are plenty of people who think it's just like absolutely terrible and there's nothing worthy in it, when actually I think there's plenty to be enjoyed from the book, not just on a story perspective, but like from a thematic perspective, because I genuinely do not think that like King was not glorifying the actions of the main character of that book. He was exploring the mentality and the psychology of it. None of it was to justify the actions, but it really makes you think about how society and certain other aspects of growing up can affect a kid to maybe go down a path like that, which is why I think the book should be read by more people. Like, I genuinely think that more people, especially fans of Stephen King, should read Rage to experience it and kind of get a little bit of a thematic idea of what it's about, rather than just kind of, brushing it off just because King doesn't want it to be published anymore. So, it's another book that I think is underrated and underread, relatively speaking. So, anyway, the basic premise of what this video is about and what I'm saying is underrated is a measure of audience appeal, not size. It's how much people broadly enjoy or dislike a book compared to what you think they should enjoy it as. Overrated is kind of the same idea. It's completely independent of the number of ratings or readers. It is solely based off of how those readers tend to rate it. Underknown, or similar terms, is the measure of the size of a reader base. In short, if you love a book that you don't think enough people have read, please stop calling it underrated, because that's not necessarily the truth. If it is underrated, you can call it that, but generally, if your point of talking about a book is to get more people to read it because you think more people should read it, then call it underread. It is severely underread or underknown. Not enough people know about this, etc. That is my soapbox today. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, so to speak, and I really hope this video didn't turn anybody off to, this kind of a discussion. I really wanted to make this because, you see it all the time, people calling things underrated when I don't think that's what they mean, but I think those people generally just don't often know that that's not what they mean. They might not realize that when they say it. So, this video is just kind of bringing a little bit more awareness to that fact, and I hope it was helpful for some of you out there. But thank you for watching if you did. I'll be back next Tuesday with a review of East of Eden by John Steinbeck, a book that is neither underread nor underrated because it actually has quite a higher rating than I anticipated, and has been read by a lot of people. It might be Steinbeck's most read book, and if it's not, it's second only to The Grapes of Wrath. Well, actually, maybe Of Mice and Men is up there too, but the point remains. I'll be back with that review next week.